Everyone, welcome to another OTD military history live stream. Looking forward to this one today. Been wanting to get today's guest, Dr. Philip Blood, on the channel for a long time. Finally got a chance to line up our schedules and get a topic that we want to discuss, and one that I think is extremely important. So we've got lots to talk about today. We're going to kind of play it by ear to see how we're going to go in terms of length and everything like that, but I know it's going to be a good one, and there's tons of great info and some very interesting discussion that's going to happen today. So just without further ado, I'm just gonna get it going. So thanks again for coming on. Appreciate it, and I already know this is going to be a good one.
Thanks for the invitation, Brad.
Oh yeah, of course.
This, as you hope folks will gather, has been very long of interest in my career. Mm-hmm. And pre-academic career, so it goes back a long way. Yeah. And I'm very pleased that you've hosted me on this one.
Yeah, like I said, we've been talking about this a while ago, I think last summer, and just things kind of got away from us. So it's good to get this going and talking about this, because obviously it's a topic that interests both of us, and we've both looked at this in our own ways and different ways, and lots of people are very interested in this topic. And it's still a current topic. Like I think somebody said on Twitter, it's still current. So it's unfortunate, but that's the case. So I think we should just jump into it, I think.
Okay. So just for some background, this was a book. It still is a book. It's a manuscript, which I have yet to not so much finish as to decide whether I want it to go. Right. Funny enough, it was actually written at the same time that it was finished at the same time as doing my PhD. So a lot of the story is kind of running in parallel with my PhD. So it's like a story within a story.
Right.
But just as a little bit of a background, but if we start with the first slide, which is there was always a danger when surrendering. This is not the issue. And I want us to just take on board that the most horrendous moment for a British prisoner of war, for any prisoner of war, is that moment of capture, because there's a very good chance you're going to be killed as soon as you put your hands up. Mm-hmm. And it happens. It happens not just on the British with the capturing Germans and Germans capturing British, same in Japan, same on the Russian front. There is a moment, and it's the heat of battle, and things go wrong. And sometimes, because the soldier is in a condition of berserk, firing away, he doesn't see, and soldiers get killed. So it's actually a very dangerous moment. However, the moment when a soldier surrenders is not the issue in this subject that I'm about to talk to you about. So if we go on to the next one. And that is that criminal behavior occurs away from the combat. Now, it's still a war crime to take a soldier and to kill them once they're a prisoner of war, but to my mind, I think it's the one point where there is huge contention, because to me, that's murder. It's not just a war crime, there's a murder taking place. And I think what's actually happened with a lot of the situation in Normandy is we've assumed that the killings are all in the heat of combat. Right. Well, actually, they're not. And there's a good reason for that. And if we move on, I'll start to explain. Now, just for some historical context, going back to 1915, there have been all these stories between British, Canadian, and German forces that they've conducted violence against each other. And when I say violence, I mean outside of the realms of combat. The British and Canadian and German soldiers have done things to each other which have been quite unpleasant. Now, obviously, the ugliest rumor from 1915 is that somehow German soldiers crucified a Canadian soldier. Similarly, from studies made by the various German military authorities during and after the First World War, there was the idea that the British armies, they had a mountain of evidence that British soldiers used dum-dum bullets.
Right.
And these pictures from a German record show what they suggested was dum-dum bullets. To me, it may be mal-manufactured bullets, but it could also be that British soldiers deliberately cut the end of the tip of the bullet to make sure that when it did hit somebody, it would leave an unpleasant mess. And of course, we know during the Dieppe raid that Canadian soldiers were very badly treated afterwards. There's handcuffs stories and accounts of what happened then. So brutality between the Canadians and the Germans and the British long existed before what happened in Normandy. Right. So if we just move on. So to start this story, you have to really kind of, and I'm only going to do this very brief, is to understand what the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler's clique was all about. And really, the two men behind this story is Heinrich Himmler in the picture and Sepp Dietrich, attending an event in Metz in 1940 after the first German victories in France. And the SS is suddenly turned from this bodyguard unit that's been supposedly protecting the Führer and the Nazi regime, is turned into a state defense force, and various regiments and units are expanded, and the Leibstandarte is expanded towards a divisional level, and they create a cliquey kind of persona within the SS organization.
Right.
And that makes them very exceptional because, okay, they're seen as Hitler's elite, which of course generates a certain attitude and a certain culture, which is very unique to this group of soldiers. Now, you can say that the other SS units had similar kind of things, but not quite to the same degree, because Himmler and Dietrich are agreeing to all kinds of manner of things happening that you don't see in normal everyday military process. For example, many of Dietrich's officers serve on Himmler's staff or also serve in concentration camps under various forms, like Mengele. Dr. Mengele, who's a medical officer, ended up doing medical experiments in Auschwitz after having experienced with Leibstandarte. And similarly, Joachim Peiper was with Himmler on his staff, studying many of the extermination camps and concentration camps and knowing full well what the Holocaust was about. So to assume that Hitler's bodyguard didn't know anything about the war that was going on around them, i.e. Hitler's war, is, of course, an error. Now, if we move on. So there's a group of officers who are taken out of the 1st SS and become the 12th SS. And they're very significant because they are selected for the running of a division which is going to become, if you like, some kind of a youth division within the SS, which will take in these young men and make them permanent political soldiers for Hitler. Now, the way to do this is to get certain leading officers within the SS, within the Adolf Hitler Leibstandarte cadre, and take out the best ones to wean this division to a very rapid level of capability. And one of the top soldiers, or within this group regarded as top soldiers, is Fritz Witt. And the interesting thing about Fritz Witt, because he's killed in June 1944, he kind of gets lost in the story because he's very early killed. Now, the thing with Witt is he actually joined the Nazi Party very early on. So you're looking at somebody who's a young Nazi from the outset, and he is not joining for career reasons. He's joining because he is a believer. And of course, the power of his faith in the regime and in Hitler leads him into various activities. For example, he's one of the most leading figures within the murder and destruction of the SR.
Right.
And as a consequence, he's rapidly promoted because his faith is shown to be proven in his loyalty to the regime and to Hitler. And he gets, if you like, a form of rapid promotion through the system. He takes part in serious crimes, one of which in April 1944 is an incident that took place in France when the 12th SS Division was first being put into maneuvers and taken down into France. There was a French resistance attack, and the division members of the division went into Ask and took reprisals, and I think killed about 163 people. So at least 2 months before the fighting in Normandy, this group of men have already committed a serious crime, not just with the 1st SS Panzer Division in Russia and elsewhere, but actually within the colours of the 12th. So the 12th has been identified as committing a very serious crime. Okay, later on he's killed with naval gunfire, but we'll come back to that and discuss it later. So if we move on to the next one. So one of his first regimental officers is Kurt Meyer. Meyer again joins the police very early on, but he's also a police officer when he joins, which just shows this idea that somehow the SS were taking young career people who were unemployed or suffering difficulty or were outside the system is not true. Many of these young men were already in good careers, or would have been for their kind of lifestyle they were raised in. And given that back in 1930 things were not so good in German society because of I forgot what it's called now. It shows you how bad my memory is these days. The Great Depression, depression. And he's come through all of that, and he's risen quite high into the Leibstandarte. And again, he's another one of these guys who very early on have shown their loyalty to the regime, and has got a series of events in his past, especially in Russia, when he shows that his brutality outweighs his capability as a soldier. Mm-hmm. And we're going to come back to that again. So the next one. Now, Wilhelm Monka is again another one of these early members. He is very unusual in the sense that he actually seems to like to fight. Meyer's seen in pictures fighting, and he has all the image, but Monka, he really does actually appear to like to fight as a fighting soldier, and his fighting and his killing get wrapped into and he very early on in his military career is probably responsible for what happened at Vermouth in 1940 when British soldiers were murdered by Leibstandarte. There may well be a reason why we could talk about that later, but at this stage, that's just his background to this. He's the 2nd Regimental Commander of a Panzer Grenadier Regiment of the 12th SS Panzer Division. So if we move on to the next one, Hubert Meyer is one of the senior staff officers he's the IA, which is like the main operations staff officer of the division. Various stories, he's either regarded as pretty mediocre or very average.
Yeah, that's yeah.
So I don't know what to say about him, because he's actually one of the few with a degree.
Right.
I believe he had a degree in engineering or science. So he's one of the few educated ones, but he seems to not be very capable on the fighting front.
Right.
He briefly is commander of the division in September after Meyer is captured. But as you can see, it only lasted a month, and they never trusted him with a senior command afterwards. It's very interesting that he and Meyer were at staff school round about the same time in preparation for coming to control the 12th SS Panzer Division. And it's very clear that what they were learning in the two staff streams, one was very much a bureaucratic stream for learning how to do paperwork, mapping and planning and all of that stuff. And the other one was very much into Panzer Grenadier operations,
Right.
which, of course, would later limit Meyer because his understanding of armoured warfare rather than just Panzer Grenadier warfare, but the overall armoured warfare was somewhat limited, and it shows in some of his actions. But anyway, we'll move on. So just to give an idea of what the standard operating procedure for the Waffen-SS was, having had its experience in Russia in 1941, was if their troops suffer at the hands of the Russians, the retribution will be massive and immediate. Now, there's a very significant thing here about that, is there's no judicial process. So the idea that the SS are going to judge somebody who kills one of their own through a legal process it just won't happen.
Right.
So on the left picture, you see, on my left, you see a group of mass graves, which is supposedly a motorcycle unit which was butchered by Russian soldiers in 1941. The Waffen-SS old boys would always refer to this crime as a reason for their brutality and why they were brutalized in combat. I mean, it's absolute tosh. Yeah. And it's very interesting that from the 70s, this story disappeared. And they kind of went down another route, trying to show that they were really soldiers like any other, which of course they weren't. They did take photographs when they were doing unpleasant things. And as you can see, the Russian tank soldier who's been captured by an SS officer and a field policeman, not exactly the happiest looking individuals. And then apparently the picture on the right, and I'm not sure whether it's true or not, is a series of Russian soldiers who are about to be executed and being selected by Waffen-SS soldiers from the Leibstandarte in 1941. And there were a lot of films and pictures made of this, which obviously when things got a bit difficult for them, they disappeared. But they suddenly came up again in the late 60s and 70s when they were trying to justify why they behaved the way they did. And of course, again, a lot of this content disappeared. You have to really dig deep into the old literature. You really have to interrogate the sources as an academic historian to really get to the bottom of this content that the Waffen-SS used to keep. In particular, if you look at some of the SS magazines, Das Volkskorps, they would have pictures of unpleasant moments and records of death and what have you in normal articles. Almost for some reason to not go beyond radicalization of the troops, but to express their power and their anger and show their might to themselves.
Right.
Okay. So if we move on. So we're coming now to 1942-43 when the decision's made to raise the 12th SS Panzer Division. And I've taken these from my copies of actual 12th recruitment booklets. And this is your future, the sword, your way in the SS. These are the messages, but actually, if you read into what they're actually looking at, they've taken the period of the victories. So they've had the wins in France and Yugoslavia and Greece and those that period of war to frame the future for these young men. So you actually see, if you look at the threads, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but you would find there is national prestige, career advancement and promotion, an awful lot of propaganda. So, for instance, if you win the war, you're going to get lands in the East. And then ideology, race is a constant, that they're a master race, and that even the Western allies that they're fighting against, they're not real human beings. They will have to be removed, or they will become slaves. And there was none of this idea that somehow these great German masterminds are going to rule a perfect world of white people. It was for themselves. There was never going to be, the French were always going to be slaves. The British would become slaves.
Yeah.
The Russians would be destroyed because they were Slavs. The Jews will have been eradicated. That's implicit to all SS recruitment. And to think otherwise, well, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, next.
Not really much to say there. Yep.
There's been a lot of stories that the young people, the kids, if you like, they're often referred to as the kids. They're fed milk and Smarties and Sweeties and what have you. All of that story is utter rubbish. These young people are between 16 and 18, and they're attending institutions like this, which is one of the Adolf Hitler schools in the Eifel, not far away from me, Ordensburg. And what this is showing is, to a certain extent, the architecture of the environment they're being brought up in. It's not just a way into the countryside, learning how to be good Germans in their lederhosen and short trousers and stuff. It's to actually follow certain patterns. And if you ever studied German Nazi architecture, stairs play an enormous part. There's the stairs which take you down to the future and lead you to the battlefield, and there's the stairs going upwards which take you to Valhalla. Different ways of looking at them. If you look at the architecture here, the chimney, which is actually the tower on the top left, very similar to the chimneys and the towers in design in the gas chambers at Auschwitz. That linkage between architecture serving to support the training of troops and future political cadre of the Nazi movement is also figuring into the architectural designs of the extermination system.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the idea that somehow their lives are not interlinked to the Holocaust is a fallacy.
Yes.
They are part of the next generation of Nazi leadership, and that's going to be, if the job hasn't been done already to remove the Slavs and handicapped people and Jews, then they're certainly going to be the next bearers of the sword of that. And that's going to be their future, and that's going to be the way they go. And they're being taught hardcore racism and exterminationist racism in their classes. And that will be continued when they go to the military schools like Bad Tolz or the SS non-commissioned officer school in Jülich. They will have the same education. And if you read the courses and the way the seminars put together, you can see that the plan is, we're going to rule the world, we're going to have the land in the east, we're going to have a great empire, we're going to be the master race, and all the other races are subservient to us. Okay, so we move on. So I just want to compare that now with Canadian recruitment, because we have to accept that the Canadians are not neutral in this. We you know, they're not just the victims, and they're not neutral. They're playing a part, and they're trained as soldiers. But but their identity is very important. It's very different. So you have the national identity, which is that Canada is, you know, a new country in a sense, and it's got a new future, and it's also linking itself to the past with its empire. So, you know, Britain is in need of help, and Canada's going to help, and there's a masculinity in that. Yeah, it's not. It's the Canadians going back to help the motherland. That's a powerful message. So, you know, I don't think the Canadian soldiers, by any stretch of imagination, believe this any more than anybody else would have believed it. But I do think it was an inspiration to those who volunteer for a short period before they actually went into combat, that they were doing something that was good for humanity. I mean, okay, they don't at that stage know the extent of the Holocaust, I expect, and they don't know where all of this war is leading, but they do know that the Germans are not good for everybody's health and that they have to be got rid of. And so, yeah, so, you know, the recruitment posters here, some French, some English, they're creating another identity, and that identity is going to hit that SS identity. And what comes from it is going to be very bitter. Yeah. Because there's different, you know, that's an ideology. That's Canadian ideology and Canadian future. And that's worth fighting for Canadians. Yeah? As much as the SS are going to fight for their future. And that's going to make a bit of fight. The idea that somehow the Second World War is, you know, there's this glorious bunch of soldiers coming in to fight for you know, for a democratic future, and we're all going to be able to vote, and we're all going to have a nice future, and everyone's going to be great, and the Nazis have to be got rid of. There's some certain truth to that, but there's other truths as well. And so that's why I wanted to put that there, but I don't want to spend too long on that.
Yeah, I just want to give you a quick break for talking for a second. But yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. That's why I didn't want to jump in while you're discussing it, because that's a great way to put it. And I always like to remember that people are always motivated by different things. Not every individual is motivated by the same thing. Some people just wanted a job. Some people were tired of being at home. So that's always part of it. But I think framing it as this clash of identities, or sorry, of ideologies in the, you know, true sense of the word is fascinating. Yeah, it's a really interesting way of thinking about this.
Move on.
Yep.
So the day occurs when the Canadians go into action and the SS go into action. And what I did here was to put some confusion up. So this is like messy history for me. So the Canadians have landed, and the whole weight of the Allied invasion has hit the beaches on the 6th of June. And the SS response is aggressive. 7th of June, they go for the baptism of fire. Meyer is told by Witt to kick off with the 25th SS Regiment. The counter is blunted. His driver, Helmut Bielke, is killed. There's serious losses. Somewhere in that mix, there's killing of Allied POWs. Then they suddenly decide that, well, this isn't working.
Yeah.
And on the 10th of June, they go pretty much on the defensive, round about the time when Panzer Group West headquarters are destroyed.
Yep.
Then on the 11th of June, Rommel announces that the Allied Air Forces, there's a warning, we've got to be very careful. 13th of June, there is that surprise moment when Wittmann is caught in a fight with the 7th Armored Division.
Yeah.
And on the 14th of June, Witt is killed by naval gunfire.
Mm-hmm.
And around all of that, to add to the scene, I want to include in yellow the broken cohesion, the broken coordination, the increase in losses, the no reconnaissance capability, no counter-air capability, absolutely almost no comms, and absolutely no Auftragstaktik whatsoever. Yeah.
Yeah.
So scrub everything that they learnt in school.
Right.
Scrub everything that they've ever experienced in Russia, and I'm talking about the tough guys, Witt, Meyer, Monka. They can scrub all their combat experience, and now they're fighting for their lives.
Mm-hmm.
Now, as you can see, one of the 3 sets of pictures, I put all of these senior officers on motorcycles and cars. Why is that? Well, they can't communicate properly, because what the British and the Americans and the Canadians and the Poles have done is absolutely turn the German battle space into a horror zone.
Mm-hmm.
So they're now going to fight for their lives. Now, the German response to this is to be extreme. Now, if we go to the next slide. So if you look here, Wunsch's talking to Witt and Meyer on one side. On another picture, there's a couple of German soldiers, and they've been hit with shock. I mean, this is real. This is the West in action. And it doesn't matter how many panzer divisions that they combine in this area in Normandy. What they're experiencing from the Allies is something that they don't get in Russia.
Right.
You can, in Russia, before the Red Army goes on to an attack, it waits until the panzer divisions have been moved and that the area is thin. So if you look at the famous Bagration, where the Russian army piles in from the east and goes towards Warsaw, they wait until there's only 2 panzer divisions in Army Group Center area, and then they unleash hell. Right? And they really do unleash hell.
Yeah.
And the Germans fold. Okay. And then they push everything down into a channel and literally race to the next frontier. Now, the Germans, to stop that, the Germans have to remobilize their tanks. And as soon as there's a large body of tanks against them, the Russians stop.
Yeah.
And then look for another soft place. Now, to a certain extent, if you've been taught that your panzer divisions or your experiences, your panzer divisions and your armor is so invulnerable, so powerful, you can just stand your ground and fight. That's quite good, because it means you can hold your line or you can advance. So previous battles post Stalingrad, the SS have fought at Kharkiv, they've retreated and they've punched back, and they've been fairly successful, and they've all got medals for that. And it all seems very good because they can pretty much fight with impunity, because they don't have to worry about air cover, because the Russian air cover is held to a minimum. And if they fight in a clever kind of way, when the Russians apply their gods of war, the artillery, they can move around and maneuver around it. We can't do that in Normandy.
Nope.
And what actually happens, and you can see this picture, that these 3 guys have suddenly been hit by shock, the shock that they don't know how to cope with. And the answer is, how did the Germans respond? They respond in the only way they know. When an army is losing, it's to use extreme measures. And depending on how far you're feel free to use those extreme measures, you'll start doing unpleasant things. So if we go on to the next slide. So I'm taking here interrogations of German soldiers who've been captured from round about the 9th of June right the way through till the end of August. Just to give you an idea of the numbers I've got, about 3,500 interrogations of upwards of 60,000 German soldiers, including Waffen-SS men. Some of this evidence came directly to me from British interrogation officers who were assigned by 21st Army Group to investigate a series of crimes that they discovered. Now, one of the sets of crimes was obviously Abbey Ardennes, where they found the Canadian and British soldiers thrown down the well. Now, 21st Army Group, being not like the SS, Montgomery immediately insisted there would be no revenge, there would be no reprisals, and he demanded that there was a proper investigation and a post-mortem. And he made this comment: the last thing he wanted was his troops running around chaotically killing. He wanted to maintain the discipline because the British and the Canadian forces were to be held to a discipline code, because that's how he wanted it, so that they fought properly and didn't get distracted with irrelevant things. Now, here I've got the findings of that first set of studies, which is on the 14th of August 94. There's little doubt that the troops of the 12th SS Panzer Division had instructions to avoid taking POWs, and that the troops in this division were impregnated with the belief that Allied troops were fair game when taken prisoner. Now, I've included 4 more examples of the kind of killings that were going on. If you go on to the next one, this is where it becomes slightly more interesting. It's not just the Waffen-SS that's committing the crimes.
Right.
The Wehrmacht's committing crimes. This is just one sample from 2 sets of reports that I've got, a collection of particular crimes. And as you can see, we've got parachuters, grenadiers, medical orderlies, staff officers, rear area, forward fighting troops, civilian officials, all reporting significant numbers of crimes. And if you were to look at all of the crimes that are taking place, you've not just got the killing of French civilians, Allied prisoners of war, but there's also significant cases of rape, where German soldiers are raping French women. There's also plundering and looting massively. I have the case of Remke, who was the Fallschirmjäger parachute general. He was captured in a staff car that was full of looted silver.
Yeah.
And they were all for it. As soon as the decision was made to run round about the time of Falaise, they were packing and stealing and grabbing as much as possible. So the point of all of this is it's not just the Waffen-SS who are committing crimes. Within the whole of the Western Front, the German army in 1944, all the German armed forces are conducting a significant amount of crimes. Now, some of those crimes are committed in the heat of battle, and they've killed soldiers at that time. But there are others. Most of these crimes are perpetrated after the fighting, after the combat. So, for example, you read of Polish German soldiers who decided to turn tail, and the NCO in command will get the Germans to shoot on them. Similarly, where there's a group of French workers who might have been, I don't know, in Caen, working on ruins when the Allies landed, suddenly turns their guns on them and shoots the French civilians. I was surprised at the sheer volume of numbers of crimes. Once the Allied interrogators were put to the task, the numbers of crimes that were coming were quite incredible, and the details.
Right.
Now, the question that we're going to have to face is, why doesn't this content come into the military history? So if we go on to the next slide. Well, this is one of the reasons. So in 1940-45, the Prisoner of War Interrogation Service, which is closely linked to MI19, has about 29 officers and 35 NCOs. Now, from a strategic intelligence perspective, they're raising the training of 1,200 officers and 700 German-speaking staff to work. And many of those trained serve either in the British, Canadian, Polish armed forces or in the US Army. But by the time you get to 1945, you're now shifting towards war crimes administration, interrogation, pre-prosecution, then prosecution.
Right.
What you're noticing is the numbers have gone down to 52 officers and 120 ordinary ranks. And then gradually, those numbers have fluctuated a little bit, but the numbers of criminals that are being managed are very small. And that's where the problem lies, because you can have as many stories as you like. If you take the Le Paradis crime, you've got the case against Fritz Knockline. And to a certain extent, the evidence against him was palpable because many of his own people picked on him, which kind of puts into your mind, maybe he was the fall guy because he wasn't very popular. But anyway, by the by, in a case like that, there was enough evidence to build up a case against him, and he was eventually dealt with. The problem with cases like Meyer, Monka, and these others was, first of all, they were either captured in Meyer's case before the process started, and then he literally went through series of processes. So he's a prisoner of war in the British Armed Forces, goes to Canada. In that process, he's going through different regulations, different procedures, and at the same time as that's happening, attitudes towards war crimes is thinning. Believe it or not, the longer the Nuremberg war crimes was going on, the more the soldiers were saying, "Oh, look, we've got to end this because it's just not working." Even though there was a desire for a lot of justice for the victims of all the crimes, not just the Jews, the Slavs, the prisoners of war, the civilians who'd been maltreated as slave laborers. The willpower of the West to continue war crimes trials was on decline. And then by the time the Churchill government comes into power in 1951 or thereabouts, they actually end all judicial work. And Lord Liverpool, the famous Lord Russell of Liverpool, who wrote the book The Scourge of the Swastika, he's one of those who gets sacked and is thrown out of the system and is forced to write books because the British no longer want to be part of it. And the Canadians, to a certain extent, go a similar way. Now, I'm not going to go down the Meyer trial because that's written about by other people. So let's just go on. So we come to the end of the war, 1944-74, to the period 1974. And the reason why I want to put those there is that is the kind of stock history. Okay. The British, the Canadians, Monty, there's our story. We fought the war. There it is. There's not much you would there's not much difference from when Monty talked about the gathering of the panzer divisions into Normandy, and then imposing chaos and horror and shock and awe on them, to when Chester Wilmot is writing about that first period, to later when Belfield and SME are talking about the fighting in Normandy in 1970, similar to, you know, even units like the 7th Armoured Division or any of the other British units that produced their own histories at the end of the war. Yeah. There's this idea that maybe if we don't get it down in print there, it's never going to happen. You ain't going to hear our story. It'll be a historian who'll tell it 10 years down the road, which is what Chester Wilmot does, obviously. But the soldiers themselves want to get their story down, and the story is out there. And if you read the 7th Armoured history, it's not greatly worried about Michael Wittmann, because he didn't really figure. I mean, he got slapped and the division, you know, won the war. Yep. So no real interest in him or anything else. It's just the period that they had to fight, and they had a strong fight on the morning, and then in the afternoon they kind of carried on winning. Yep. And that attitude is very important because it's very understated.
Yes.
You know, I don't know how to say this, but if you read a book about the Franco-Prussian War 1870, written after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, 71, 72, you're not going to get much in the way of, we kind of, you know, we struggled, we fought. No, it's going to be victory. We won. We're the master race. We're the powerful. And that carries on. And it comes back again 25 years later when the anniversaries are going through and the new Kaiser is on board, that somehow they're a great nation. And that was a different impetus. Britain's an old nation, and it's been around, and it's been in many wars, and it's been, so they won, and nobody cares.
Yeah.
So we thought nobody cares.
Yes. Okay.
and it's an element of complacency, and that's very different from what we've had now, this exceptionalism which is occurring in a great deal of literature. Back then, they didn't think they were exceptional. They just thought they'd won a war after a tough old fight, and they'd come out, they'd won, and they wanted it recorded.
Yep.
And that's, to a certain extent, how the veterans spoke. But I don't think the veterans knew what was going on in Germany. So if we move on. So here's Mr. Meyer.
Yeah.
So having been captured in a German army uniform,
yeah,
the Canadians very kindly supplied him with an SS uniform, which I thought was very generous of them, yes, given that at Normandy, the SS was turned into an illegal organization by law,
yep,
and none of them were allowed to wear their eagles and Nazi eagles and such like. So I think that was very generous. Anyway, he comes out of prison having accepted that he was guilty of massive war crimes, ha ha ha,
yeah,
and becomes a hero in the old Comrades Association. And what you see here is in those years when he's out, which I think was from 1954 to when he dies in 1961, he does several things. One is he joins the old Comrades Association. He's seen here partying with Jochen Piper, Sepp Dietrich, and I think it's Gunscher or Wunscher, I can't say properly. He writes a book called Grenadier, and then he dies because he's actually a very sick man.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing to do with the time in Canadian prisons. Some people have tried to suggest he was actually a very unhealthy individual.
Yep.
He'd been an unhealthy individual for a long, long time, and how he managed to survive even during the wartime is quite remarkable. He's just somebody who drank a lot and did everything to the extreme. And so there's a funeral here, and several thousand people turned up. And he's being treated as a hero.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in 61, Grenadier, his book has gone out, and he's telling a story in there, which is later, not now, not in 1961, but later would become one of the building blocks for the new story of, quote, the lost cause.
Yep.
So what you're seeing here is his passing and his legacy. And as you see from Der Freiwillige, you know, on the issue to commemorate his passing, they've got that famous picture of him at the front with a rifle in his hand being a soldier. All the imagery came back, all the pictures came back, all the stories came back. And as you can see, there was enormous floral wreaths, and old soldiers carried his medals, and he was given a hero's funeral. Now, if we go on to the next one. Now, this one was incredible because Sepp Dietrich, this is the passing of Sepp Dietrich. The passing of Sepp Dietrich in 1966 was quite remarkable. There was at least 6,000 people in attendance. It was filmed on German television. And if you look at the people who were involved, and as you can see there, I spent a bit of time taking individuals out. But the one individual that seemed important to me was a guy called Lammerding. And he was in attendance as the former commander of the 2nd SS Panzer Division. And he's the man who's responsible for the Oradour-sur-Glane murders, which took place at round about the same time as the 12th SS Panzer Division was committing its crimes. And it struck me as very interesting because at that time, when this funeral took place, the SS Kameradschaft, the organization of the old boys, were making big statements that, you know, what happened at Oradour was correct. It was retribution for terrorists, or as they call them, bandits, trying to kill them. What they actually, for a period, were endorsing was the old Waffen-SS rule, which is we don't go to judicial process, we commit retribution. Okay. And so you look at this picture and you can see this slide, and you can see just how much of that part of the old Nazi society has come together to celebrate the passing of this man. Now, Sepp Dietrich was, for want of a person, Hitler's bodyguard. And he had a reputation. I mean, everybody goes on about him being a butcher or some kind of meat merchant, and he fought in the First World War at the latter part in a tank, and you know, all of that stuff. Well, yeah, so what? The real purpose here is he's the man who decided that his formation was going to be the way it was. He glorified in its behavior. He took medals. I mean, he grossly overstated Wittmann's achievements against the 7th Armored Division, said they killed a regiment of 25 tanks, I think, Wittmann killing. And that wasn't unusual for the SS. They were very good at giving themselves medals and awarding themselves medals, and Hitler, because he, you know, had his favorites, would allow these guys to get what they want. So, you know, you see all these medals and badges. I mean, apparently they put them all into a chamber pot in 1945. Well, it's funny how they got them all back, isn't it?
Yeah, I know, right? Funny how that works out.
Yeah. Anyway, having got their rancid medals back, as you can see, all of these guys who had got the Knight's Cross for whatever they'd done, and most of them had done it in some strange places, like, you know, Dietrich, who everyone talks about Dietrich as this great SS commander who fought brilliantly at Arnhem. What they all forget is that he was a cavalry commander in 1941 with the SS Cavalry Brigade,
Right.
hunting Jews into the woods and killing partisans, and generally being quite an unpleasant character. And why we would want to be honouring somebody like Dietrich just because he starred in the film Bridge Too Far is quite beyond me. It truly is beyond me.
Yeah.
And
Sorry, just one quick question. Those are the medals from the war, correct?
apparently, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree about the movie. Yeah, and everything. I see it all the time online, on YouTube especially. He's treated as some sort of, I don't know, good Nazi. I don't know. I don't know what to call it. Yeah. Anyway.
Well, so let's move on. How are we doing for time? Are we all right?
I'm good. If you want to keep going, I'm good.
Okay. So in Germany between 1970 and 1982, you see certain things happening. And what I see now is actually the criminal organization of the SS starts commodifying itself. And there's very good reasons for it. And it's quite rational. One is they need pensions.
Yep.
Now, there's been a constant argument that anybody over a certain rank wouldn't get a state pension because if they were colonel or above. Well, you know, in Germany, I'm not sure that actually happens. I don't know anybody who is denied something, even if the social welfare system says, okay, they're not getting a military pension. Well, we have to give them something, so we'll give them state welfare. And I think what you actually see is two faces in Germany. And it's not the Germans' fault. Don't get me wrong. This is something that happens with all veterans. The veterans will look after themselves and they will create their own communities, and that happens in every nation.
Yep.
The public face of Germany is Willy Brandt kneeling before Warsaw Ghetto statue, because he wants Germany to atone for the crimes that Germany's been responsible from. So he is, you know, in my mind, he's one of the few German chancellors who's prepared to show the courage of standing up and saying, we did this, we have to pay. Yeah. Now, while that's happening, you've got Herbert Meyer, or a few years later, actually, who's been invited to Britain.
Right, yes.
To take part in a series of television interviews for Thames Television, right? And he's arrested by a British government and he is thrown out of the country. Now, remember, Britain is in the European Union, so technically it cannot do this, but it did it because, quote, he was a war criminal.
Yep.
Andrew Mollo he was at the time in the 70s and 80s quite an interesting man, because he was not prepared to shy away from Nazi crimes while at the same time studying the SS. So a pictorial history of the SS, you would think, is all, you know, bang bangs and tanks and what have you. Yeah. Well, it's not. He is very clearly making the point that this whole organization was illegal and was racial, and he makes a very clear message that if you're going to study these people, you have to understand it's not just the military side, there's the political, the ideological, and the racial, and that they are killing people in large numbers, and that they're a murder organization. So when he writes his book, because of a consequence of all the arguments over whether Thames Television Thames Television, by the way, was then a British independent broadcaster. I think they were part of the World at War series.
Yes, they were. Yep.
Yeah. So he writes a book to the Death's Head, which is not often read by scholars anymore. And it's not particularly interesting, other than it's showing that in 1980, that there are people around who say, we've got to know, before you start liking this stuff, you've got to understand the full story.
Right.
Hubert Meyer, bless his cotton socks, buggers off back to Germany and produces this book, which is the history of the 12th SS Panzer Division. and he is totally livid, which is interesting because, you know, up to that point, he's just been a staff officer. Now he's going to be a big dude in the old Comrades Association, and he starts producing a large collection of literature. And it's very interesting because it's almost reflecting what happens after the First World War of rewriting a kind of a lost cause.
Yes.
Which, if we move on,
yep.
The rise of the lost cause is very poignant because it's happening at the same time British and German writers are questioning British and Canadian and American performance in Normandy. And at the same time, right, so it's really quite complicated period. At the same time, you've got Ronald Reagan getting up on the stage at Normandy and elsewhere, saying things like, well, you know, Germany is now part of us, or the German soldiers who fought in the Second World War were all brave, and even the Waffen-SS ones. So you've got this kind of, I don't know, it's not so much forgiveness as let's ignore what's happened in the past and start telling porky pies. And of course, there's been problems with Hastings' book on Overlord. There's been problems with Carlo D'Esti's book on Decision in Normandy. And of course, the perpetual stories and examination of Hans von Luck's book on being a panzer commander. Now, to a certain extent, I can understand why Max Hastings writes the way he does.
Okay.
I don't like any of it.
Yeah.
But I can understand. What I don't understand was, on the basis of the evidence that was in front of him then,
right,
he's writing this book in 1984, why he went down the route that he did. Okay? Because there was enough evidence to show that you didn't need to write about the Germans in quite the way you were doing. For example, you know, people talk about Wittmann being caught by the 7th Armored Division responding and fighting. The reason why Wittmann's there is largely because the Germans have got no reconnaissance capability.
Yep.
So they have to use the Tigers in a reconnaissance form, which is not what they were intended to be, which is why he not only fights, but then runs.
Yes.
And he runs to escape because he can't use communications, because ever since the Allies took out Panzer Group West, all of the field commands are frightened to death of using their wireless systems. So they have no comms.
Yep.
So they're running around in motorcycles and runners and tanks to get information. Now, that's remarkable.
Yeah.
But our friend, Max, he writes about the greatness of Wittmann.
Yep.
Almost to the detriment of the 7th Armored Division as the most useless division that's ever existed. I take personal offense because I've got one in the I had one in the family, a desert rat who'd fought with the 7th Armored from when he was wounded in Tobruk in 1941 right the way through to Berlin in 1945. And their story about, you know, how they fought is a hell of a lot different from the way Max Hastings describes them.
Right.
And I asked the question, why? Why would a historian push forward the idea that the SS were some kind of wonderful soldiers, and the 7th Armored Division, which had been continually fighting for nearly 4 years, would be reduced to some kind of useless organization that I have difficulty understanding why you would do that as a professional writer. I mean, I'm not calling him a historian because I'm not sure that's the case. He's a writer, he's a journalist, and he writes and he follows and he sees. But, you know, I question some of the research because the interrogation of the evidence doesn't kind of fulfill the levels that an academic historian should follow.
Right.
Similarly, on the same basis, I find it very difficult to explain Carlo D'Esti because I think he's a very nice guy. But here's the problem. He found himself in a British institution in 1984, and he was so fed up with the way he was being treated in a British institution in 1983-84. He wrote what he wrote. And I think later, as I understand it, he preferred not to talk about the book, and certainly on many opportunities would say, well, if I had a second chance, I'd write it differently. I think Carlo was an exceptionally good historian, as a military historian, not the Grand Monte, but he was a very good military historian. I'm not going to talk about Hans von Luck because I just think it's a load of old trash.
Yep.
I put the Bitburg thing there for people to have a look because it's a Wikipedia page, and I thought, well, that whole story gets forgotten, so there it is. If anybody sees this page now, they'll be able to run to their computer and immediately look it up.
Yeah, if you're watching this later, pause it and go read up.
Right, off we go. So 1987, Craig Luther comes along, and he makes an attempt at what I would call finding a balance between the history of the crimes and the military history. And the problem with military history is a lot of the military historians who, do their thing, say things like, well, I'm only going to do the military bit.
Yes.
And so how do you separate it?
Yeah.
How do you separate the politics, the ideology, the violence from the military? Where's the smooth lines? And what Craig Luther did, which I find interesting, sadly the book has become known to be some kind of Nazi book because of the publisher and what have you. But actually, if you look closely, he's actually using the archives, and he uses the archives brilliantly to piece together an argument which is very, very interesting. His view is, okay, we're dealing with young soldiers who are put under a lot of stress, and they're conducting the crimes, but not all of the crimes are conducted by young soldiers. There's these older hands who are ordering the killing because that's what they've done. So a fairly decent story, a fairly decent book, sadly overlooked because an awful lot of people, as I say, think it's some kind of neo-Nazi publication, which is, well, maybe the publishing house was, but I think the contents were quite well done. I've cited it several times in the book. I mean, he doesn't use all of the sources that I use, but there are a lot of things there which are very important, especially the Schaeff inquiry reports on the 12th SS, which is often overlooked.
Yes. Yeah.
So if we move on. Now, we come to what happens with the Monka case. And really, I'm not very interested in the Vermouth crime in 1940 when British soldiers are killed by Leibstandarte. What I'm interested in here is, and what surprised me when I look back, because I never really thought about it at the time, was a fund for the survivors.
Right.
Well, I've never heard of the survivors ever receiving the money. Now, they might well have done, but I've just never heard of it. And it's like the whole story just kind of faded away.
Right.
So for the period 1988, 1994, there was an awful lot of Monka had caused these. We need to put him before the courts and charge him. But the evidence was very thin. The Germans didn't expel Monka. Rucker tried several times to get the papers. More papers came out. But the problem with his pressure to get the papers released was the PRO, as it was known then, made quid pro quo and decided to close a whole load of papers which were important to seal them up. That's what happens in this game. And it's same thing happened with the cases of the Channel Islands. Just when you thought you got all of the paper, and a whole stack of stuff suddenly disappeared and was put under another period of control. The magazine World at War II Investigator made a huge issue of this, and to a certain extent, a lot of money was changing hands in the magazines, the programs, the discussions, the television, the events in Parliament, and I'm not sure that it was for the benefit of the Vermouth massacre survivors or for history.
Right.
I'm not convinced. If Rooker or anybody else can say to me, yes, it changed everything, fine. But I haven't seen anything to suggest it changed anything. It was like Scotland Yard investigation of SS men who had been involved in the extermination services in the East during the war, who had come to Britain as refugees through the system. There was a massive investigation by Scotland Yard, and they never found anybody. And I think that's the problem. The evidence isn't there. It suits a political argument to suggest that there was something, and we know whenever there's a case of a war criminal like Pinochet when he was in Britain for a period, it creates an alarm. There's a moment of kind of pre-social media activity, and then it disappears. And then it disappears.
Yeah.
So if we go on. So this is me. I decided to run an investigation of the crimes myself. And in this case, I did take pictures of the places. And this is Chateau, where I believe 18 soldiers, maybe more, were murdered.
Yeah.
What interested me was this had been one of the SS regiment's headquarters, and there are pictures there of Hubert Meyer and Kurt Meyer and blah, blah, blah in the courtyards and in the area and in the fields. Different stories of what happened. You hear no one actually saw anything, no one witnessed anything, but there are stories that someone heard machine gun fire, people being killed. Someone stepped over graves later of dead soldiers lying in a heap. I'm not so sure. The French said the men were taken out to various points and executed at certain places. Before the file of post-mortems, which the 21st Army Group had collected with the photographs, what I had seen before the file conveniently disappeared was some pretty horrendous photographs of how these men have been treated. I got the impression, and I'm only going from my notes and memory now, that several of the soldiers had not only been shot in the back of the neck, but they had been hacked. And it wasn't post-traumatic, post-death trauma. It was while they were alive. And that tells another story. Anyway, go on. I just wanted to have a look at the conditions. I mean, the trees would have been around at that time because of the growth and the aging. If they walked the men away to execute them, as one magazine suggested and showed the points where the bodies were laid, that is murder.
Yep.
I have a word for it. You've led somebody along the path, and these are the paths I took from where I got evidence where the bodies had supposedly lain. I worked out with my tape measure and what have you, roughly paced area. If they'd walked them that far from the main buildings, everybody knew what was going on.
Yes.
So this is premeditated murder, and it's cowardly. Let's face it. I mean, there's nothing honourable going on here, and it's simply because they're in a state of shock. They're trying to recreate some kind of energy to get them back into a fighting power, and they're going to make these British soldiers, Canadian soldiers suffer.
Yep.
And that revenge is going to build up the power to fight onwards. Actually, I don't think it works. I think it turns a lot of the 12th SS men who I notice from this moment, when they're captured after the 9th of June, they're very gabby.
Yes.
And why are they gabby? Why are they gabby to the interrogators? Because they know they've done something wrong, and they are, and I'm going to use a rude word now, Brad. They were shit scared that they were going to pay.
Yes.
Right. So, can we move on?
Yes.
How are we doing for time? All right.
I'm good to go as long as you want to keep going.
Okay. So Hubert Meyer, he's back again. Now gets his books translated. So you've got this period, 92, 94, lots going on because Rooker is pushing to get more information released from the archives. The Old Boys organization under Meyer, who is the last president, folds in 1992. But before they end, they decide to start to translate all of these books into English. And of course, there's the history of the 12th SS Panzer Division. It's very expensive even then. It was a solid book, massive pictures, a memorial book in every sense.
Yes.
Very much like the books that were produced in the 1880s and 1890s after the Franco-Prussian War, and very much like the books that produced after the First World War in the 1920s and 30s. Very rich, very glossy, lots of photographs. A huge section on the ending of Fritz Witt and how he's blown up, which, you know, for some of us was quite entertaining reading. And then, so if we go on.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
So then we come into the Ambrose years.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not going to talk about the books because I know people like them, and I'm not here to destroy people's likes. If people like that stuff, that's down to them. Not for me, okay? What I got from all of this with Ambrose was Saving Private Ryan.
Yeah.
And there is this one moment in Saving Private Ryan which I still find absurd.
Yes.
So the 2nd SS Panzer Division has had this huge fight with Upham and his mates, and Ryan and Tom Hanks. And a group of the guys of the Germans have been captured, and one's a German soldier, and all the others are SS men.
Yep.
And Upham shoots the German soldier. The irony of allowing the 2nd SS men to escape, having committed Oradour-sur-Glane and the killings in Toulay. I mean, that just screams over my head. I mean, how you would come to that moral judgment of the SS man. I mean, even one of the dudes at the back there is laughing. It just struck me as so terribly shameful. And, you know, there were still lots of veterans around.
Yes.
In 1994 who were coherent. And several were in the family, and they went to see the first 40 minutes, and they all said, yeah, that's kind of like it was, but it's hard to tell you about war because there's things like smells and
yes,
all the personal things that you're going through when all that's happening around you. And fine. So, yeah, okay, the first 40 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, fine. But what that film did for me was just said, enough. I've just got to stop watching war films. They ain't doing anything for me anymore. And I really haven't haven't really been able to watch them since. It's not representative of real war. Real war's ugly.
Oh yeah.
It's brutal.
Yeah.
It's just revolting. And okay, play the parts if you want, but to me, no. Yeah. And when you get to an absurdity where Upham is shooting the German soldier and letting the SS go, well, fine. We're in an upside down world, and I don't want to be bothered with that. So let's move on. So I did another investigation around at this time when I tried to compare what happened at Abbey Ardennes with what happened at Oradour-sur-Glane. Now, the interesting thing here is, and I'm not using it for the investigation, but I'm using it for commodification.
Yes.
Now, you would think, after the most horrendous thing has happened to that village, that people would want to make sure that the place survived without having to pay entrance fees and journals and magazines and all the rest of it. You just want it preserved because it represented such horror.
Yes.
In Europe. And looking back, I actually had to buy all of these journals. I don't mind.
Right.
Don't get me wrong. I don't mind that I paid for those glossy things to help understand and explains and what have you. But it struck me that maybe that was odd. I don't know what it's like now, but back then, because Oradour didn't figure so much in the outside world. I mean, it's big in, don't get me wrong, big in France. Germans try to ignore it, but if you talk to anybody who was doing the history of the SOE, like I got involved in a huge argument with MRD Foote, who was an SOE officer serving in this area and was captured at Brittany by the Germans and was very badly beaten up. But my argument with him was, when you're doing what you were doing in that part of France that led the Germans to do what they did, what was the benefit? And he said, well, it slowed the division down. I said, what, 5 days?
Yeah.
And of course, the problem with MRD was he understood that he was a very brave soldier, gone through a lot of pain and wanted to be respected for that. And the fact that the SOE had done something wrong was difficult for him to come to talk about. Right. I understand that. They were given a mission, and the soldiers had committed an act where the commander of the SS division, as it was coming up the road, Lamending's guys, the SS, desperate to get the man back, decides to inflict retribution on one of the communities, and at the same time had been hanging civilians along lampposts in Toulay every time the resistance attacked. But looking on that, there was never any point when SOE sort of questioned what had happened.
Right.
And I felt, and I still feel uncomfortable the way the SOE is and the history has kind of floated over it. It's not that the British were doing, or the Americans, or whoever, the JEDBRA or the SOE teams who were doing that, those operations at the time were breaking any laws. It's just the fact that they were contributing to incidents taking place. Now, on the other hand, that doesn't give the Germans the right to do what they did.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And the retribution that the Germans committed in Oradour is in the same parallel of what the Wehrmacht was doing in the West.
Yeah.
Now, so having challenged it, I'm now going to put it back into its true context. Everybody wants to put Oradour as an exception.
Yeah.
And I would say Oradour is as much one of Rommel's crimes, and I'm saying Rommel here, as much as one of Rommel's crimes as the Canadian soldiers being killed, the French women being raped, and the slaves and other people were being murdered by German soldiers in the West. Oradour's part of that.
Yes. Okay. Yep.
It's central because it's if you understand what happens at Oradour in the process, you can see why crimes occur elsewhere in the French area.
Right.
I know it sounds odd, but the way they conduct the killings in Oradour is not far away. You think, oh well, Abbey Adam, they kill people and they throw them down the well. They throw them down the well because they haven't got enough petrol to set fire to the bodies. Whereas in Oradour, they spark the flames in the church to destroy all the people, and then stand around to make sure everybody's dead. That's killing. That's destroying the evidence.
Yep.
Okay, a couple of people escape and get away.
Yeah.
So it comes. A lot of the evidence of the killings elsewhere is only rumor, hearsay, unless the actual soldiers involved confess to what they've done, and one or two have, and one or two did. But it's a similar story, covering the evidence. Okay, so that's a standard operating procedure, and you learn that stuff when you've been fighting an ideological war in the East, because the destruction of Oradour was incredibly efficient, and you can only do that if you've done it before.
Yeah,
and
right.
The Second SS Division had done it before many times.
Many times.
Shall we go on?
Yep.
Away from the gloomy. So
to another gloom. Yeah.
Now, I know this is going to be painful to a lot of Canadian people who think this series was a travesty. And I understand that. The problem with a travesty is it has a legacy. And legacy has a way of continuing. And I don't think many people quite understand what happens when you try to do something like, quote, relativize war crimes. So if we go on. So Terence McKenna says, the story of what happened to prisoners on both sides is one of the darkest chapters in the Second World War. Really?
Okay.
So if we go on to the next one.
It doesn't get any better.
Now, what he's done, or what they've done, is they take an actor to bring life to Meyer. And then they come up with, his defense. And they make the defense real. So we've gone out of judicial process, and we've said what he says is correct.
Yeah.
The problem with this, as will be discussed later, the problem with when you do this with war crimes is you're actually saying he's right.
Yeah.
But no one's ever found this notebook from a dead captain. Now it could be, and I'm happy to engage with anybody who says that who agrees or disagrees with this, but it could be that the Allied soldiers were told you can't take prisoners in the first day.
Right.
You're invading, you're landing on beaches, you're running up cliffs, you're fighting in areas where there's going to be a lot of brutal fighting. You can't stop to take prisoners. And that's confined to the opening moments of the invasion. Well, that's the same as the First World War. If you're running towards a trench and the defenders are firing machine guns at you and sticking their bayonets up at you and you finally win over, you're not going to have taken many prisoners. That just happens in war. But this is something else. This is a defense that's created later. Now, the interesting thing about this is when you look at that, is when did he dream it up?
Yeah.
Now, Meyer was the first of the senior SS men to be captured. So he was isolated, right? Now, because he's isolated from the gang, he doesn't know that they're going to create excuses and alibis.
Yes. Right.
What he should have done was say, well, Fritz Witt was the commander, nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
I followed his orders. He's the divisional commander. He issued the orders. 7 days later, Witt was dead. So do what the rest of the SS did after 1945, which was to blame the dead man.
Yeah.
But Meyer wasn't, and he's still convinced somewhere along the line that Germany's going to win the war. So if he craps on his commander, his reputation is buggered. So he can't do that. And I think that's one of the reasons why he comes up with this thing.
Yeah, right.
So if we go on to the next one. So now we get the other side of the fence, where you've got the testimony of Edward Ashforth, who everybody knows, and who is the centre of all investigations of British war crimes during the Second World War, who's told this story. Well, really? Where's the investigation? If that actually happened, when did we find out about it?
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't mind investigating crimes if British soldiers have committed crimes. I'll be the first to look. Why didn't he commit that to the interrogation officers of the British Armed Forces and say this happened, or to them MPs?
Yeah. But
there is no evidence of that. Now, okay, the MPs would probably have said something like, well, Germans are bad people. The only good ones are dead. So it's quite possible. But it's also possible that this is a story that's been dreamt up long after the war.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
If we go on to the next one.
Well, just real quick, I want to say for this, I mean, the details just also don't make any sense because of what we know. That's the evidence from the time. It makes no sense whatsoever, and it gets repeated nonstop, which is just so bad.
I love the sand dunes. The sand dunes must be full of bodies still.
I know, and they've moved since then. So, are the bodies moving with the sand? It doesn't make any sense.
So, I mean, of all of the story confessions, the one that I have the most difficulty with is this bloke Dietrich. And I can't make him out at all, because if you listen to the testimony he gives all the way through the series, he does strange things like, I was taught to hunt, and I would run around with a hunting rifle shooting wild animals, and that taught me how to hunt German soldiers running around with a rifle. Then he tells this other story, and then he tells other stories throughout that, and you're thinking, is this really credible? And where's the evidence? And why would a general wait until he's retired before he told the story if he's such a good general? Why didn't he do an investigation when he was a senior officer? And I just feel very uncomfortable when an officer of such rank comes along and says, well, the bodies were piled up by the bridge. Dietrich felt very bad about what happened.
Right.
Really? Well, if you felt very bad, why didn't you do something about it?
Yeah. And again, sorry to jump in, but Dexter's other history is, he's very well known. He was in command of the Canadian Army. So, and he serves in the Congo as a peacekeeper. So,
I wasn't going to bring that up.
Sorry?
I wasn't going to bring that up.
I know. Well, that's why I want to kind of just let you go, because it's different. But
it's just that if you mention colonial things, you're immediately called woke, and it's
I don't know
as a historian and blah.
But that's just the Canadian context of him. But I agree with you. It makes literally zero sense. It just anyway. But I know why these things happen the way they did in the series. But that's for another time, I think.
Yeah. So if we go on, so then the story of Brigadier Harry Foster's comments, I don't believe Meyer pulled the trigger.
Yeah.
What's that got to do with anything?
Yeah, it has nothing to do with anything.
Yeah? Did he really say that?
I doubt it.
Anyway.
I don't think so.
So let's move on. See, the problem is all of this is relativizing war crimes. Yeah,
exactly. Yep.
And so we get to Terence McKenna again. It says, while the German atrocity and others like were prosecuted, reports of Allied atrocities against Germans never pursued. The message seems clear. War crimes committed in a good cause are politically acceptable, perhaps regrettable, but such crimes are prosecuted only on the side that loses the war. So let's not prosecute all those Nazis who were killing Jews and Russians and Americans, or let the Malmedy crowd go and just not do anything at all. What? So what were we fighting for? Why did we fight Nazism if that's if that's the conclusion that we come to?
I mean,
I have other issues with the McKennas.
There are, I've already covered a bunch about the Hong Kong episode on the channel.
But what this did, as far as I was concerned, was so relativize war crimes.
Yep.
Enabled the people who thought that the SS were, quote, just ordinary soldiers like any other, were given license because a television program, quote, a serious television program, had given them that license.
Yep.
And this is one of the reasons why social media today is even harder to combat. Because when social media does this, boy, do we have a problem.
Yep. Which is happening every day.
Yes.
Anyway.
So here we've got my investigations going to another level now. So let me put cards on the table. I don't mind people wearing uniforms and playing soldiers if that's what they want to do at the weekend. Okay. I don't particularly like people who are doing it in SS uniforms, but if somebody wants to wear a German army uniform and the day is, Brits versus the Germans and the Germans always lose and it's representative of something or other, then who am I to complain? What I just found incredible was this idea that somehow when you join these organizations and you wear the uniforms, that you go through some form of ritual. Now, that second battle group, I met the guy who was a recruitment man at one of these military shows.
Mm-hmm.
His comment to me was, well, we don't do the Hitler oath, but we take an oath on the gun barrel of a 75mm gun. Okay.
What?
Okay. He didn't know that I'd kept my recorder running when I was. He wouldn't let me film, but I kept the sound recording. The point here is why, if you're just militarists being military, why would you need to do an oath? Yeah. And so. I know some really nice guys who like collecting SS stuff and do SS uniforms. All that stuff. I'm not going to out them and say, look, you're fascist for that, because I know they're not. I do know that people are interested in all kinds of things. I mean, I'm interested in trains.
Oh yeah.
And my model soldiers, and I painted Waffen-SS men. That doesn't make me a Nazi because I painted model soldiers of 12th SS Panzer Division, but neither do I run around sticking them out in the shop saying, yeah, I'll sell them and making money from it. I mean, that's just me. I have a war game and I put up model soldiers against other model soldiers to see how things happen or work. And That just happens to be one of the ways that I work out the way things happen in history. Where I think we have a problem with people who wear militaria and take it to the nth degree is what happens when it gets serious. And it can get very, very quickly serious. And, you know, I'm not saying any of these guys were, but back in the 70s when, you know, some of us were fighting the Nazis in the form of the National Front. I mean, I was a strong member of the Anti-Nazi League. And as a young man, I know I got into an awful lot of trouble politically fighting David Irving's people, you know, yeah. and people like that. And I've been a very staunch anti-Nazi supporter. I know that doesn't make me very popular in a lot of corners, and
right.
Well, tough.
Yep.
I don't care, and I will stand up against National Socialists, fascists, or any other anti-democratic grouping. But this is rank commercialization, and I feel very uncomfortable with it. You know? Yeah. Play your uniforms, collect your stuff, have a great time. Don't put it on my shelves.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Yep.
So I have to talk about my professor, because in 1997, he says to me, we're going to do a PhD. So I showed him all the evidence. So here you are. This is the conclusion of why the book never got published.
Mm-hmm.
So I put it all together, and Richard wanted to see not only the work I'd done on the investigation of SS war crimes and my analysis of the 12th SS Panzer Division, and my analysis of the people who'd written about the 12th SS Panzer Division and the 1st SS Panzer Division. All I said, he said, under no circumstances must you go forward with this stuff, because you will be out before you will be out of the system before you have a chance of getting into it.
Yep.
Now, at the time, I thought, wow, it seems a bit odd. And he said, no, if you go down this route at this moment, because you need to create a proper academic base, afterwards you can sell the book. But not until you've done the PhD properly in a subject which is independent of all of that, yeah. And where you show documentary evidence. And I said, well, but some of these 12th SS men are still alive. And this is the point. And he pretty much said the same thing to me. I mean, this is taken from an article. I have never felt that eyewitness accounts so long after the event are of much value. And he pressed that on me, yeah, as his student in 1997. The interesting thing is, I hadn't realized how far the British Army knew of certain things in their own records until I met Richard that afternoon in August 1997. And what actually he said to me was, look, I can introduce you to British military interrogators. I can introduce you to intelligence officers. I can introduce you to veterans who fought in the Second World War in certain of these places. And some of them might tell you things that you will find very surprising. Mm-hmm. And I said, like what? He said, well, there is a view, and this is Richard saying this to me now, there's a view that the reason why the Leibstandarte killed the British soldiers at Vermouth was that they were found with dum-dum bullets. Mm. Okay. And I was very surprised. I asked a relative who had fought in that campaign some years before, and I said to him, so what was the fighting like? And he said, oh, it was pretty tough. And he said a lot of the lads would, you know, as we were retreating, would resort to things like cutting the ends off the bullets just to slow the Germans down. And that story hadn't kind of registered with me too deeply at the time.
Right.
When I listened to Richard, I said, Richard, I know a soldier who fought in such and such a regiment and did this and on the way to Saint-Nazaire. And he said, yeah, there's loads of stories like that.
Mm-hmm.
I was a little bit surprised. And he said, Richard was very much into knowing how the ordinary soldier functioned.
Yes.
One of the things he said was, a lot of the soldiers had fought in the colonies.
Yeah.
And they would do this stuff out of normal routine operation. And I was...
Yeah.
So he convinced me to drop all my research and start work on a completely different subject, but using my knowledge of the SS to open the doors to get me going. Now, we think that this discussion on SS and Nazis and all the rest of it has no long-term effects. Well, I put the Battle Guide book up because around about 2003, Richard was made president of the Battlefield Guides organization.
Yeah, the guild, yeah.
And he invited me to go along to the moment when he was going to be made president. And it was a great honor because, we did a few things together, but this one, it'd never gone to any of these kind of honorary things. So he went along and he said, look, I want you to be the liaison officer for the Belgium ambassador because he's very interested in war in the Low Countries. And seeing as you live in that part of the world, you two can have a chat and you can escort him. And then I'll go through the process of whatever. And then we'll go and have a few beers afterwards. I just finished, I think I'd finished my PhD the year before. And I was kind of that period when you're thinking about what you're going to do with the rest of your life. And so it seemed like a great idea. And we'd already had a lot of beers on the night that I graduated. So to go out and have another laugh with Richard would seem like fun. So I turned up, of all places, the Royal United Services Institute in London.
Yeah.
Okay. So we are in big deal scenario. And he's about to give Anthony Beevor's about to give him the award. So Beevor's got up to give the presentation. As he starts to give the presentation, Herbert Meyer's son-in-law, I'm not going to mention any names, starts giving Beevor all kinds of stuff about the 12th SS Panzer Division was this and that, and they were the best soldiers, and you've got to help get my father-in-law back into Britain. And it was just totally inappropriate. Okay. But it shows how this thing with war crimes can come up in the strangest of places. Now, the problem here was that Beevor took animos in such a state that he stepped off the podium and didn't present Richard's award. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so to a certain extent, it was this thing coming back and haunting a situation. And that's one of the problems with this, not dealing with the war crimes properly. Mm-hmm. It has a way of coming back and biting you on the bum when you least expect it. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So anyway, there you go. Little story about the boss. Shall we move on?
Yeah.
So having told me not to get involved in the 12th SS Panzer Division, he then sends me to this is Richard Holmes for you, yeah? I mean, he was such a dude. So he says to me, look, Reynolds is a bit of a piece of work. You've got to go and talk to him because no one else is prepared to be at this event who's from, you know, who knows the subject like you. So I said, okay, so this is 12th of May 1998. As you can see, Mike Reynolds, because it was a paid event from the Military History Circle, and I at that stage was quite a fairly meaningful member of the RUSI, having been a member for over 21 years at that stage. I joined when I was at university first time.
Mm.
And so I was kind of like one of the elders without actually having published an awful lot or done an awful lot. I was like an elder in the group, and everybody knew that I knew about this subject. So
Right.
there I was, and here I am. And the book was given to us because the lunch was paid for, and you got a book. Okay. So, so I'm sat there with the great general, and he starts talking about how marvelous this division was.
Jesus.
Right?
Yeah.
What great soldiers were. But then he started to launch into an attack on how bad the British soldiers were.
Mm.
And to say that I was gobsmacked hearing a British general be so condescending about British soldiers would be an understatement. So, of course, my first comment back to him was, well, I used the F word. So,
Yeah.
How the fuck can you support Fritz Witt when he was a murderous son of a bitch?
Yeah.
Oh, there's no evidence.
No, Jesus Christ.
Right? So from that moment, it was like, ruck. So I got a call the next morning, Richard saying, so you... I hear you had a good lunch. I explained, he said, yeah, well, you know, don't worry about it. So when I get the book home, and this is the point here, there is this chapter on crimes.
Yeah.
What you have to notice is where he got his evidence from for the chapter. And the point is here, Hubert Meyer, Kurt Meyer, and Sayer and Berting. Now, to say that's biased is just ludicrous. It's like he's suddenly become an Obergruppenführer overnight. And he was, well, this general thing.
Yeah.
And he was, well, it was so bizarre. And subsequently, I came to the conclusion it was more than just making money by that stage. Yeah. You know, even today, right. If you do a book on the SS, and I know this full well, if I wrote a book on the stuff that I know,
yeah,
it's liable to sell. Okay, yeah. I know that for a fact.
Yep.
But here is another political issue. He was a subject of almost a kidnapping in the 70s, I believe, by the Red Army faction. So right. He took total umbrage against anybody who was anything other than more right-wing, more conservative than the conservatives.
Yeah.
And he decided to take it upon himself to be the defender of the SS in Britain and elsewhere. And it was just incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know what to say because I don't know. It doesn't make any sense. None of this makes any sense of why he did what he did.
But the commodification was so rank. I mean, I can understand Hubert Meyer saying, "Oh yeah, well we've got to have memorials left for when we disappear." But here, this is just something else. And of course, he managed to get his own publisher to say what a wonderful book it was, which is always a bad sign. Yeah, it's always a bad sign.
Yeah.
Anyway, so if we move on. So Howard Margolian comes along, and to a certain extent, he doesn't quite he doesn't quite change what Karl Luther has done, but he does do something which I find quite interesting. He weaves the story together in a more war crimes criminal level first. So instead of going military history to crime, he goes from crime to military history.
Yeah,
both have their issues. I understand that. But both books, I would say, if you read together, you're very much closer to getting somewhere realistic. I still think there's things missing.
Yes. Yeah.
In both of them.
Yeah.
And that's because I've read all of these other files, and I've built up a picture, which is that the Germans on the Western Front are fighting a very, very violent war, and not just against the Allies, against everybody else around them. Yeah. But these two books, very good. So let's not linger. Let's move on. Now, in Germany, you're seeing things like this program on the equivalent of, say, BBC, the Waffen-SS. It was really well done. And they kind of went into Monka's crimes. But what got me about the Germans at this time was they create their Untergang, which is the downfall. And in many respects, it's regarded as a great film, focusing on those last 10 days or whatever of Hitler. But Monka comes out of it as a hero type figure, this honorable SS man fighting to the end and then surrendering. And you look at the two and you're thinking, something went wrong there. How did that happen? I don't want to blame the Untergang as making the SS better than what it was. But I think in the search for heroes, which is very, very difficult in those last days of the war, they kind of made Monka less unpleasant than perhaps he should have been.
Right.
The fact that Monka ended up going to prison and was in solitary confinement for 6 years afterwards, and supposedly had that incredible meal before they were arrested and taken away by the NKVD, the later KGB. I don't really care about stories like that. He was a political soldier caught by a Red Army, which is a political army, and the consequences are, you behave badly for 4 years and you get what you deserve. And I couldn't think of it happening to a better person, to be honest.
100%.
Anyway, so I'm not going to go. I know a lot of people like that film, and of course the meme of Hitler going mad and over ice cream cornets and all the things, and World Cup finals. I mean, it's constantly brought up all the time, and it's a fantastic portrayal of Hitler. Fine. But there's a lot of that film which really, it goes back to my thinking about Saving Private Ryan. Perhaps we shouldn't go down making these films. They're not serving any great purpose, really, other than making memes.
Memes and money.
Yeah. Shall we move on?
Yeah.
So then we come to Anthony Beevor, and he makes these comments. Now, my concern with Beevor is, and I made it at the bottom there, endnotes that do not perform as adequate research notes. And that shouldn't be an essay, it should be adequate. My concern with Beevor, apart from the fact that he behaved the way he did with Richard, is that he's creating these books which are pure commodity.
Yep.
And the scale of commodity now is such that even Hubert Meyer's book is made into an easy projectable, and all of it, this whole entirety of literature is in this kind of mix, and it's very difficult for people to say, well, okay, I can see, I'm reading Meyer, I can see it's not really very good, or I'm reading Anthony Beevor and I'm wondering where the hell I am, or others and others and others. The problem is we've lost the plot.
Right.
We're now so far away from what Chester Wilmot and Montgomery and Ellsfield and Sami and all of those guys, that we're in a strange place. We've rewritten the history of D-Day. We've accepted such nonsense that Montgomery was this bad general because it suits the American argument, because that's what American soldiers wanted to portray at the end of the war, to get their story out. So you got Chester Hansen and Bradley, and Hodges. I mean, you get this wonderful situation where Montgomery can be completely vilified for what happens over a 10-day period. But the fact that Hodges and Bradley are stuck in a forest for 3 months is neither here nor there.
Yeah.
And nobody says anything. Now, let's not relativize the difference between the commanders, but I would say this. Once Montgomery was out of control after Falaise, the Allied campaign went completely off the rails. It went everywhere but where it should have been, which was winning the war.
Yeah.
We get into this mess. And I think when I read books by Beaver, who wants to, play with the myths and tell stories, fine. But do it on the strength of evidence, not on that.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I like Anthony Beaver. Don't you?
Not particularly, no. No, I'm just trying to keep my tongue today.
Leave me to say the nasty bit. So, fortunately, academics have come back into the frame. I've stopped in 2016 because I have a lot more to say about other things. And 2016 was the point when I decided that I will actually finish this book and it will go forward in due course to publishers. But I've got 2 projects to do first.
Okay. What
I wanted to do was to say, look, academics have come back to the frame and they've started to address the problems. And John Buckley's Monty's Men, loads and loads of people say to me, God, it's difficult to chew through.
Yeah.
Well,
right.
That's what academic history is about.
Yeah.
It's hard. It's hard to research, and it's hard to write, and you can't really, sort of make it happy chappy type narrative.
Yeah, right.
Because you're dealing with hard facts. And so, yes, I can understand why a lot of people say, well, Monty's Men is hard work. People say that about my books. It's hard work because it's so detailed, and I understand that.
Yeah.
But you've got to have those books to bring a base back to how we understand things. Now, I don't agree with John's interpretations on Monty and a lot of things in that book, but I do appreciate that he's gone to an awful lot of good effort to produce an interpretation that is valuable to historians.
Right.
And when I say historians, I'm talking about academic historians. I'm not talking about popular writers. So I think that's an excellent base to look at how the British Army and subsequently there was Jonathan Fennell's book on the British Army, which is also, fantastic read. We have to claw them back. We have to claw research back. And one of our friends, Jonathan Ware, I know he's been working on a book on British Division, which hopefully will come out soon. And it is so rich in detail.
Yeah.
We need more of it. Now, on the German side, Gerhard Gross has written The Myth and Reality of German Warfare. Now, I know Gerhard from old. He, like me, thought the whole Auftragstaktik thing was nonsense. his view on German warfighting is not what has developed. Good piece of work. The book, The Myth of the Eastern Front, I find difficult because while it's an important attempt at taking on the Wehrmacht fanboys and the SS fanboys and all of those people, the problem is there's an element there of, I don't know how you call it, but pointing the finger and saying, "No, you play with a computer game, therefore you are inherently nasty, and you wear uniforms and you're inherently a Nazi," and I think that's wrong. I think people engage with history in different levels. Those who politicize their history, like those who want to take blood oaths while they're pretending to be SS soldiers, that's one thing. But somebody who just likes to collect uniforms and run around. I mean, I was with a Frenchman and a British guy, Frenchman and a Belgian guy who were playing the parts of a British soldier and a French soldier on the Battle of Waterloo on Sunday.
Right.
And you can't get any more political than the French army of the Napoleonic Wars. And you can't get any more conservatively political than the British army, and monarchistic as the British army of the Napoleonic Wars. But the two guys are not going about ideology. They're showing you how guns work and how uniforms work and how muskets work. And that to me is very important. That's as important as somebody who says, "Look, I know how an MG42 works." We all hear about Nick Budd going on about MG42s and stuff. And, it's important that we know that stuff. We know that to know the rapid rate of fire and that the barrels don't melt and there's a way of holding this stuff. And that's all important, good stuff. And I think reenactors have brought insight to the wars,
right,
all the way through, that we wouldn't have. And I think, in my case, I nearly joined the Sealed Knot, which is this English Civil War lot, when I was very much younger. And what struck me about those guys was they relearned how the English Civil War was fought. That's stunning. Yeah? Because if you read the books, they will dance around with a rapier and all that stuff. Really? Well, when you actually see them doing it real time, they're not dancing around. They're obviously fighting hard, and it's very bloodthirsty. So my problem with the Myth of the Eastern Front is it's a bit too spiteful, and it's not considering the value of what reconstruction, these living history, that's the term. What living history is actually bringing to us. And I think an awful lot of it's very important. So next one, last one, is it?
Should be. Yep.
So there you go. The subtitle of my book, The Tragedy of Military History. And the tragedy is that a lot of those soldiers there are still not understood. And that for me is the greatest tragedy of all. And I've gone out, as you know, and what we've talked about here, I've been mostly doing the Germans. But I have a huge interest and knowledge of British and Canadian forces of the Second World War, because I was brought up to it and brought into it by my relatives, and listening to all their stories and going down the Legion and listening to the soldiers, and also taking part in the 50th anniversary of Normandy and all of those things that went on. And I still can't see why we have not really understood who those men are. And I'm not talking about the officers and the generals. I'm talking about the average soldiers. And to me, that's the saddest thing that's happened in the tragedy of military history. It's gone down this route with Reynolds making piles of money and denigrating the soldiers.
Yeah.
Disgraceful, absolutely disgraceful. I want to know who those men are.
Yeah.
That's my end.
That's a good end. Yeah, no, you're right. Sorry, I'm just hesitant because I'm not because you're wrong. I'm just taking it all in. That was fantastic. Lots to think about in the best way possible. I think you're right. Yeah, coming down to that end of the soldiers, right? Because I let people know I went to the Netherlands not too long ago, and lots of cemetery visiting, and same thing. It's hard to articulate it right now, but I completely agree, and how we're thinking about this and how the historiography has developed and where we've gone. Yeah, I mean, I try to do that in my own work. So it's, yeah, sorry, I'm not very articulate at the moment, but yeah.
I find it fascinating that people still struggle with the term historiography. I don't get it.
Yeah.
To me, if you don't know how to interrogate the evidence and you don't understand historiography, I can't understand why you're bothering being in history, because that to me is everything.
Yep, I agree.
If you play with the historiography and you play with the literature and you understand it and you interrogate it properly,
yeah,
your what you acquire is so interesting. It's so, I don't know, fulfilling.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, actually. I mean, I agree.
Everybody wants to be a historian. And once you do that, you can be a historian. I don't think you have to have a qualification for it. It's just the ability to understand what on earth's going on with the books and what those books are telling us and why those people have written those books, like Reynolds and Hubert Meyer.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, that was my own work, so I can't agree more. I mean, it's yeah, I agree with you about just one last thing about that historiography point of what the struggle is with it, why it's, I'll just say it, why it's a dirty word in some circles and all that. And I don't get it. To me, it's the base, and I'm sure you agree based on the last 2 hours. It's just, it frames such an important thing.
Have we spoken for 2 hours?
Yeah. The numbers went up, actually, so we're good to go. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. And you've dissected this as I would like to do with topics and built it to a place I think we need to understand it. And it's again, I'm just not very articulate because I'm just taking all that in. It's amazing. Yeah, so thank you for coming on and doing all that. That is, yeah, lots to chew on.
Thank you very much. And I hope I haven't bored everybody.
Oh, God, no.
2 hours. Yeah.
No, well, it's...
we should have stopped.
No, I don't want to stop. That's the thing. That's why I didn't, when you're like, oh, let's stop. I'm like, no, because I don't want you to stop. Because I don't want to lose the momentum. I don't want to lose it. You know what I mean? It's not the same. So, I mean, yeah, I don't really have much else to say other than everybody kind of share this, because I think this was something special and we need to get.
Well, if you want to another time have a Q&A on all things whatever, then we should do that.
Yeah, we could definitely schedule something where everyone just can, because we didn't really answer too many questions, unfortunately, but I think everyone was just so enthralled. So yeah, nobody wanted, Pete's right. Nobody wanted you to stop. Yeah, I mean, it's that was great. So
thank you, Pete.
Yeah, and Norma and Matt and Susan. There's more coming in. I can't keep up with it. Anything, yeah. Other than that, you can check those out after. Yeah, so thank you. I really appreciate it. Other than that, yeah, we'll probably get you back on and we can do maybe like a Q&A with this and some of your other work. And because, yeah, you've done lots of great stuff. So there's always an opportunity to ask questions and you know your stuff. So we definitely want to have you back.
All right.
Cool. All right.
Thank you very much for hosting me.
Oh, of course. Yeah. And anytime you want to talk about something, and it doesn't have to be Canadian. I'm telling you that now live on air. I'm trying to, like I said earlier, before we started, I want to, start to cover more. So if you want anything to discuss, you're more than welcome to do so.
Super. Thank you very much.
There we go. It's been, I missed it. He's moving. People are too fast. Bring him back. There. It's been decided.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Other than that, everyone, thank you for support and watching today. And we'll see you next time. And I'll be sure to check all the channels for all the outlets for what's coming up. Other than that, everyone else have a good rest of your day. And we'll see you next time.
Bye-bye.